being able to perform basic maintenance tasks yourself, such as changing disc brake pads, will save you a heap of time and money. And here's how. So the good news is changing disc brake pads is a really straightforward task. It requires almost no tools and very little mechanical skills. So what are the reasons why you might want to change your disc brake pads? Well, two main reasons. One, quite obviously, they're worn out. That's fairly self-explanatory. The second is they get contaminated. Now, if you're not sure what a contaminated disc brake pad is, that is when products such as oils or silicone sprays, Teflon sprays, the stuff we kind of use to lubricate our bikes, if that gets onto a disc brake pad, they're porous material, so therefore they can absorb things like oils and they get contaminated basically. So how will you better tell if your disc brakes are contaminated? Well, they'll squeal and howl like crazy, for one thing, and the other thing is you will notice that they take a lot more force at the lever to stop compared to how a new pad would perform. Okay, so we'll cover off that in a little bit more detail later, but for now, let's crack on with how to take the pads out of the caliper to start with. Now, the techniques I'm going to show you are pretty similar across the board, so it doesn't really matter what brand of brakes you're using, as the way that the pads mount in there is actually quite standardized almost across various different brands of brakes. So you can do it with the wheel in actual fact, for a good number of brakes now. You can take the pads out without even taking the rear wheel out, but just for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to pop the wheel out and we'll go from there. Right then, you notice I've popped on a set of workshop gloves. That is just to make absolutely sure, again, that no contaminants that's already on my fingers, or even just the natural skin oils, to be honest. You should really be very careful not to touch those disc brake pads, so better to wear a clean set of workshop gloves. Now, there are two things holding the disc brake pads in. There's this central retainer pin, which goes across the top there, and in the case of this particular SRAM Force caliper, there is also a little circlip which sits on the end there. Now that's just there as like a double safe really, to make sure that should that pin have vibrated loose, it would not fall out, and therefore you wouldn't lose your disc brake pads and have no brakes. So yeah, that's just an extra security method really, but obviously the first thing we've got to do is remove that little circlip. So set of needle nose pliers, just grab that and just pull that straight off. Don't lose it. Very small piece of equipment that, so pop that somewhere where you can find it on the workbench, and then just remove that central retaining bolt. It's just a 2.5mm Allen key on this particular one. Just wind that out, and once it gets to the end of its threads, you then just be able to pull that retaining bolt out. Now, so the pads are just held in under their own spring tension now, so the way to remove them, and that's why it's sometimes easy to have the wheel out, is you can actually access them from the underside and just push them up with your finger and just be ready to sort of collect them at this side as they come out, because you don't want everything to just sort of spring across the floor. Just keep hold of those and just sort of squeeze them as they come out, keep everything together, and you can just draw those pads out. Now, there is your pair of disc brake pads attached with the spring. And this is the first real opportunity to have a close look at what the state of them is like in terms of wear and tear. One thing you can do, just as a really simple guide, is if you use a credit card, I have one prepared right here, you can actually hold up a credit card, and if it's the thickness of a credit card is about 0.75 of a millimeter, and the recommended wear rate for a disc brake pad is about 0.5 millimeter. So if you're anywhere close to 0.5 millimeter, you definitely want to be replacing your pad. So this is quite a good way to sort of see the thickness, because as you can see, there's not a huge amount of material on a disc brake pad in any case. They're relatively, even if it's a brand new one, relatively small amount of pad material on that backing plate. So yeah, that's just a good little tip. Use a credit card, 0.75 mil, and then you can sort of see roughly how much pad material you've got left on there. Okay, once you've got your pads out and you've had a chance to inspect them, there's a couple of things that you might want to just take into account. One of those is even wear. So if you notice that one brake pad is significantly more worn than the other, for instance, that would be an indication that your caliper's pistons were not working evenly, or that the caliper was set incorrectly. So yeah, use that as a guide and just sort of check the evenness of the wear. The other really common one is if you've been unfortunate enough to wear your pads all the way through the pad material, if you've maybe not been able to check them in time, or you've done a particularly grubby, gritty ride and you've worn out the whole pads in a single ride, slide, which does happen, trust me, then what can happen then is you find yourself braking on the actual backing plate, the metal backing plate of the pad. That's probably going to cause an awful lot of high-pitched squealing, so you'll know about that, but and also very poor braking performance. But what it can do is then damage the actual disc brake rotor surface itself. You can get nasty score lines in the rotor. So if that has happened to you, you've been unfortunate enough to wear right through to the backing plate, do inspect your disc brake rotor surface and just make sure that you've not damaged that irreparably, and that's all in good shape, ready to go. Right, so with your disc brake pads out now, and you're ready to sort of move to the next step, which is to have a really good cleanup, really. You want to try and remove as much of that dirt and grime from around the caliper as possible. If it looks like it's predominantly kind of mud and dirt, then yeah, just hot soapy water will do a good job of that. But if it looks more like it's kind of disc brake grime, the brake dust kind of gathers in and around the caliper, then it's a good idea to use a dedicated disc brake cleaner. So yeah, something like this one, you can direct that straight in there. I say this is a new bike, so obviously it's not going to be too dirty, but just to show you, I'm going to get in there with some disc brake cleaner and some nice clean rag. Don't use grubby oily rags for obvious reasons. We're trying to get rid of any contaminants. Have a really good wipe and a clean up. As I say, this is a new bike, so I'm just kind of mocking it up really so you can see, but basically, yeah, get in there, get busy, get it nice and clean. Okay. If you're fitting new pads, what will have happened is your old pads wore, the pistons would have obviously come out to compensate for that. So you need to drive those pistons back in, reset those pistons basically into the caliper, ready to accept your new brake pads. So how do you do that? Well, there's a number of different ways you can do it. I've got to be honest, my favourite way is to actually put your old pads back in. That way you're going to protect your pistons. Pistons can, in some brakes, be made of quite a fragile material, ceramic for instance. So if you get in there with a screwdriver and start levering your pistons back, which is something I've seen done a lot, it is quite easy to damage the pistons, and you definitely don't want to be doing that because then that's a serious strip down job. So yeah, one thing, if you do want to just push the pistons back, I would say there's specific tools on the market, something like this one for instance from Park Tools, a nice wide flat blade, that's quite good. But to be honest, I would keep away from metal altogether if you can, and just stick to sort of plastic tie levers or something you can get into the caliper, and just find a point, top or bottom, where you can just lever against the body and then just push those pistons back. So yeah, that's one way of doing it. But as I said, quite honestly, my best tip would be stick those old worn out pads back in. And then, because you're going to throw those pads in the bin anyway, it doesn't really matter what you do to them. Then you can get your metallic pad spreader tool, or even a screwdriver at this point, because yeah, you don't care about these pads anymore. Get that between them, and that then you can really kind of use as a good levering for surface then for pushing back those pistons into the caliper body. A couple of things to note with your new brake pads. First is to check that they're not sided. Some of them are, so they'll be marked with a left and a right side, but this particular set are not. They're absolutely fine either way around. Just bear in mind that there's going to be a spring of some description which usually goes between the two pads. Now that's there to help the pads to retract away from the disc rotor when you release the brake. But that spring in this case has got some little hook shapes on the end of it, and so you need to locate that onto the pad and just clip that into place. And this is far easier done like off the bike before you get anywhere near fitting your pads. So then you can hold your disc brake pads together with the spring. Everything's as it should be. And then all you've got to do is just pinch those lightly together and locate them into the caliper body, and then just release the tension and let the pad kind of open up and hold itself in place. And then all you've got to do is just gently push those in until the hole in the top of the pad lines up with the retaining bolt hole in the caliper. Then all you've got to do is we're going to pop that retaining bolt straight back through. If you've lined that up correctly, that should be no bother at all. Just go straight through, tighten that up. And in the case of this SRAM Force caliper, there's that little retaining circlip as well. So I'm just going to grab that with my needle nose pliers, just like I did to take it off, and clip that into the slot at the end there. So there we go. New brake pads fitted. Now we know everything's good to go and we're ready to refit the wheel and check the alignment of the brake caliper. Okay, so that's covered pad fitting and replacement for this particular SRAM force caliper. To sort of run through a couple of other quite common examples. As I said at the beginning of the video, the techniques that I've shown you for this will be pretty much transferable across most of the different types of disc brake calipers out there. So there's an alternative design from SRAM, and in this particular one there's no retaining clip on that central pin, and also the pin in fact is at the end of the pad rather than in the middle. So in this case you would simply undo that retainer, pop that out, and the pads would pop out just as they did before with the force caliper, but this time they would come out. As you see, the only difference really is that the retaining pin is at one end of the pad, but essentially the technique for removing it is the same. And then a Shimano caliper. So this is a Shimano Dura-Race flat mount caliper. This one's got the cooling fins on top of the brake pad for extra heat dissipation. But again, a very similar system. Shimano uses a little R-clip at this end here, which needs to be removed. And rather than Allen key, they've just got a little flathead screwdriver here. So pop that through. And again, once that central retainer is undone, pulled out through the middle, the pads pop out, wriggle those out in a very similar manner. As you can see, a very different shape pad overall, sort of larger shape to the pad, but ostensibly exactly the same technique. And one final one to show you, because this one is slightly different again. If you don't have a retaining bolt through the middle, the alternative is sometimes you'll find you've got like a split pin. And the only difference here is rather than undoing that with an Allen key, you will actually have to just squash the ends of the split pin together with your needle nose pliers. It just requires you to just squeeze those ends together so that then that pin can be removed. Oh, there you go, there's the retainer. That pin can be removed through the middle of the brake pads like so. Other than that, the only other difference with this style of caliper is that the pads will only come out in one direction. So the other ones that I've just shown you in that example, those pads can be removed upwards or downwards in actual fact, doesn't really make much difference. But in this particular caliper, the pads will only come out downwards. So that's another thing to bear in mind. But again, you can see the pads and the spring, it's all pretty much the same style across these different systems. Okay, last few steps then. First thing, now we've got the back wheel in, this is the time when you want to be checking the alignment of the disc brake caliper. So get yourself above the brake, look, and then just spin that wheel. And what you're looking for is obviously to see those gaps either side of the disc brake rotor. It's really useful to have something light coloured on the floor underneath, so as you look through, that really helps you to be able to see those gaps and also check the alignment of the caliper. We have actually got a video already on the YouTube channel for how to adjust disc brake calipers and avoid disc brake rub. I'll pop the link to that in the description below. Now, one final thing to do before you get out and ride on these new pads is to just run them in a little bit. So manufacturers often recommend this sort of curing process whereby you go out and you find yourself a long gradual descent is a good way of doing it. So you can build up to a good speed around 15 to 20 miles an hour and then perform like a nice controlled stop, so a firm stop. Don't be crazy and obviously send yourself over the handlebars, but yeah, just nice controlled but firm stop. Build up to speed again and then repeat that, stop, build up to speed, stop. So 6 to 10 times should be plenty. And what that's going to do is that's going to build up plenty of heat into those pads and allow them to cool in between. And then that will cure the pad to basically give it optimal performance and also improve its longevity. So that's all there is to changing your disc brake pads yourself. Hopefully you found this video useful. If you did, do give us a like and remember to subscribe to the channel and click on the little notifications icon too if you want to be notified every time we upload new content. It's completely free and it will really help us to just continue to deliver this informative content in this way going forwards. Also, if you're after other cycling content, head over to cyclist.co.uk for the latest news, tech and in-depth product and bike reviews. Thanks for watching.